Hi there. I hope you're having a great day so far. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm Zoe. This is a relatively new channel, but I've been interested in all things true crime for many years, and I hope that you'll find some of the cases I talk about as fascinating as I do. So today we're discussing Krystian Bala, who was convicted in 2007 for the murder of a local man. The case drew much publicity and is still one of Poland's most notorious trials, as the defendant seemed to have been caught by describing details of the murder he was accused of committing in his debut novel. Was it merely coincidence? A case of life imitating art? Or was Bala some kind of criminal mastermind who had not only seemingly got away with murder, but who was now seeking to profit from it? In December 2000, a body was found in the River Odra, eastern Poland. It was found in a remote location, and some fishermen made the discovery. It was clear that the body had been in the water for some time. The river had erased much of the forensic evidence. The corpse was male, with visible wounds, including scratches on the face. A search of the missing persons database indicated that this was Dariusz Janiszewski, a 35-year-old advertising company director who'd been missing for about a month. The victim's head, neck, and arms had been tied with rope in a really distinctive way. The more he moved his arms, the tighter the rope around his neck became. The pathology report showed that the victim's stomach and intestines were empty, which also meant that he'd eaten no food for 3 days before his death. They found water in his lungs, which also established that he'd been alive when he was dropped into the water. Police searched to find a motive for the killing. They interviewed Janiszewski's wife and friends, but found nothing that could explain his murder. He was a successful young businessman. There was no known criminal activity. He didn't have any marital problems. He was a popular person, liked by everyone. Detectives were the first to admit that there was not really a lot to go on. They had hardly any leads, and the case ended up going nowhere. The media dubbed the case the perfect crime. Interestingly, it was said later that this was something that almost never occurred, except in fiction. They contacted the host of Poland's most popular crime TV show, 997. The show's website got plenty of hits and comments, but generated no real leads. Eventually, the investigation was abandoned in June 2001, and it slipped further and further from the headlines. Until 5 years later, in 2006, Krystian Bala is charged with the murder. Bala had written a book in which he appeared to incriminate himself in the Janiszewski murder. In 2003, there was a routine review of unsolved murders in Wrocław. The lead detective noticed that the victim's mobile phone was never recovered from the crime scene, even though he had had it with him on the day he disappeared. This wasn't much to go on, but it was a starting point. He assumed that the killer had likely disposed of the phone or thrown it into the river. But when he asked Janiszewski's wife about it, she produced the receipt for the phone. The detective was able to see the IMEI number for the device, which meant that if the phone was still making calls, it could be traced. Incredibly, they found out that the phone was still in use. It transpired that in the months since the murder, the phone had been sold on multiple times. They traced it back by eliminating buyer after buyer from their inquiries. Eventually, they found the businessman who had bought the phone from an internet auction site only 3 days after Janiszewski had vanished. It was sold for 285 Polish zloty, and that's about 70 euros. The seller account had the username ChrysB7, and that account belonged to one Krystian Bala, a 30-something intellectual and businessman. The detective followed Bala's online trail and discovered his blog, complete with graphic extracts from his novel, which is titled Amok, describing, amongst other things, a violent murder. To the detective, the blog read like the diary of a murderer, half hardcore porn, half sadistic violence, with hardly any real plot. Chris, the protagonist, was able to do what he liked, when he liked. He seemed to be above the law. In chapter 9, one of the characters, Mary, is murdered, tied up, and stabbed with a knife and left to die. The protagonist, Chris, then sells the murder weapon on an internet auction site. Genius, right? The lead investigator ordered the novel and read it and was struck by the many parallels between the novel and the murder of Janiszewski. For instance, the auction of the murder weapon and the phone, and the way the rope was used to tie the victims. The similarities seemed too great to be a mere coincidence. The police tried to find Bala, but they soon discovered that he'd left Poland in 2001. So the case stalled because there was simply not enough evidence to pursue a suspect from abroad. And added to that, there's still no motive established. They needed something to connect him to the victim. The investigation team do not question Bala's associates or family in case they tip him off. The last thing they want to do is warn him that he's on their radar, otherwise he might never come back into the country. There was this general feeling from the team that it might have been like a game for Bala, the murder, and then the writing about it. But it was obviously a big risk. The danger of being implicated was enormous. After revisiting the novel, it was established that a reference on the very last page might be the key to establishing a motive. And it was thought, perhaps, that jealousy was the reason for the murder. But they still had no concrete evidence to support that theory. Months passed. And then suddenly, in 2005, Krystian Bala's passport is flagged upon re-entering Poland. Bala is subsequently arrested, and over 5 years since Dariusz Janiszewski was tortured and murdered, the suspect can at last be questioned. During interrogation, the detectives made it comfortable for Bala. They removed his chains and tried to make it as easy as possible for him to talk freely. Initially, Bala had a fairly dismissive attitude. The interview didn't really go anywhere until one of the detectives asked him directly if he had had help killing his victim. Prosecutors were shocked when he immediately replied that no, he'd killed Dariusz Janiszewski alone. It seemed that he'd been irritated when they suggested he couldn't have planned and carried out the actions by himself. But sadly, this breakthrough wasn't to last. Bala suddenly started to act strangely. He was looking around the room, fidgeting, picking up the phone, playing with it. He asked for a drink, and then he said he was feeling unwell. The interview was suspended, and they called a doctor to check him over. As suspected, the medic quickly confirmed that there was absolutely no medical reason not to continue the investigation. However, when they restarted, Bala retracted his confession and he wouldn't sign any documents. Now, I couldn't find any information about this, but can only assume that there was no tape or film of the interview. Otherwise, there would have been a record already. Actually, from what I did read, even in those situations, without a signed confession, the evidence isn't permitted in a court of law. They contacted psychologists to try and understand Bala's bizarre actions, and it became apparent that he had a specific type of sociopathic behaviour, with a focus on narcissistic traits. He considered himself to be much smarter, much stronger, and much more intelligent than the rest of the population. It was thought that this mindset had dictated his curious behaviour in the interview room. Normal people would get flustered, or they would feel like the game is up when they're questioned intensely. They feel under pressure. Not so Bala. He seemed to quite enjoy what he considered the game. The prosecution now had to build a case without the confession. There was little evidence beyond the fictional murder in his novel to connect the suspect and the victim. Krystian Bala was born into a middle-class family in the Silesian region of Poland. He was the first of 2 children and was a bright and intelligent child, a good pupil. However, he did have problems with other children, conflicts and disagreements. It was said that he was argumentative, and he was what you would call egocentric. He was the first member of his family to go to university, and he studied philosophy. At uni, he creates a persona. He's confident, popular with students, and he's fun to hang out with. He had no problems attracting women. He had a good reputation. However, there were also moments where his personality would slip, sort of like Jekyll and Hyde. He was smart but confrontational. He could charm people very well, but he was also a pathological liar and a master manipulator. In 1995, at aged 23, he married his childhood sweetheart, Stasia. She worked as a secretary in the city. They had a son relatively soon afterwards. But within a couple of years, tensions between them reached breaking point. Bala had many affairs, but was also controlling and jealous of his wife. Later, friends would say that the relationship dynamic was very weird. Bala could do what he wanted, and Stasia had to stay at home, raising their child. In 1998, Bala abandoned his university studies to start a cleaning company. He was convinced that he had a bright future as an entrepreneur. It was said that he thought of himself as a great intellectual. He planned to publish research papers and basically carve out a career on the lecture circuit. But in practice, that didn't work out, and he couldn't make a living. So now he was trying his hand at being a businessman. But that also didn't really work out. Nothing seemed to be going right for him. Within months, the cleaning company business failed, along with his marriage. In 1999, the couple got divorced, but Bala couldn't let the relationship go. His obsession with his ex-wife even intensified. A witness at Bala's trial remembered how he'd followed Stasia to the bar and had this outburst, threatening to kill her and all her men. Apparently, this can be a common thing with narcissistic individuals. If you're with someone, then they see you as theirs, like you're actually their property, like a car or a house. And no one else is allowed to steal it from them. So frequently after breakups, you see them stalking and harassing their exes. In the summer of 1999, Stasia meets young musician Dariusz Janiszewski in a bar, and they begin a brief affair. Bala somehow becomes aware of what he perceives as his ex's betrayal and confronts her. On November the 13th, 2000, Janiszewski disappears. He experiences horrific abuse before his body is recovered 4 weeks later from the River Ordra. Meanwhile, back in the present, Bala is still under arrest. A media storm engulfs the city, and even the European press were there. It's making international headlines because, potentially, the murderer has described details of his crime in his book. Bala's novel becomes an overnight bestseller. People were buying it, looking for clues as to whether he was guilty or not. For many, the book seemed enough evidence to convict him. However, in a twist, the court decided that the book would not be used in evidence in the trial. Details that originally aroused suspicion were now deemed too vague. It was also suggested that Bala may have hoped to use the book as a kind of smokescreen in court, to distract attention away from his own behaviours, and to discredit the prosecution by suggesting the whole case was built on a mere work of fiction. I would call this the basic instinct defence. Sidebar. If you recall, in the 1992 film Basic Instinct, starring Michael Douglas and Sharon Stone, Stone's character is also a suspected killer, who is a best-selling novelist. She writes about crime scenes with specific details in a way only the killer would have known about. Unfortunately, Michael Douglas is so distracted by her sex appeal and lack of underwear that he fails to notice this, and she ultimately gets away with it. But she uses the same defence, the old, if I had done it, would I really be as stupid as to describe every detail in my own novel, thereby incriminating myself? I don't know, would you? Is this a double bluff? Or the perfect alibi? Anyway, Bala is no Sharon Stone, but he is visibly angry that his potential line of defence is worthless. Detectives spent months analysing the novel, but they have to accept that in the end, it's a bit of a red herring. The trial becomes a media soap opera. Opinion is divided surrounding his involvement in the murder. Bala is seen very much as an enigma, a smart guy, undoubtedly, but who also made some very stupid mistakes. Why did he return to Poland in the first place? He had seemingly got away with the perfect crime and made a new life for himself abroad. He must have known the risk he was taking by coming back. Experts argued that it showed his massive overconfidence. Basically, he thought he'd got away with it. For the prosecution, the task was immense. No reference of the novel allowed, no confession, and only circumstantial evidence so far. However, that was about to change. On the day he disappeared, Janiszewski spoke with someone on his mobile phone before leaving the office. It was established that this call came from a telephone box just up the road. And it would have been made with a phone card, which, although never physically found, every call made with it had been logged, and a list of those numbers made available to detectives. The records showed that whoever had used this phone card had also had conversations with Bala's parents and Bala's friends, and even called his office number. The magnetic phone card proved, with 100% certainty, that the card had been used by Bala. Detectives first recognised Bala's connection to the case from his decision to sell the victim's phone, and the ease with which it was traced back to him. You might have expected him to dispose of it carefully, throw it in the river, or damage it beyond use. But he ends up selling it on an internet auction site. So he's left valuable evidence out there, and effectively a simple way for detectives to trace the victim's phone right back to him. Prosecutors still struggled to prove a motive for murder. Bala always denied actually having met Janiszewski, but once again, witness testimony was to help shed some light on the truth. Remember Stasia, Bala's ex-wife? Well, one of her friends described how Bala had asked her about Stasia's new relationship, where Janiszewski worked, how long they'd been seeing each other, and other things. It was becoming clear to the court that Bala was displaying real signs of jealousy. The problem was that the prosecution lacked any physical evidence connecting the two men, up until now. But then they got the break they needed. Since Bala's arrest, prosecutors had been sifting through his belongings, which had been left at his parents' house while he'd been travelling. They found a notebook containing details of Janiszewski's company in it, and also a company pen from his office, and one of his business cards. So now the idea that Bala never knew the victim is looking pretty unlikely. He maintained throughout that he'd never met Janiszewski, never even heard that name. And here prosecutors had found items relating to him and his company in Bala's possession. Once again, his recklessness and overconfidence were damaging any case he was making, proclaiming his innocence. He'd probably kept those articles as trophies, in the way that killers often do, as a way of replaying his victory. I guess he just didn't expect them to ever be found. That TV crime show 997, the one that tried in vain to catch the killer in 2001, was also mentioned again. Detectives pointed to mysterious hits on that website in relation to this murder. It was unusual because the same types of comments were coming from different places in the world, mainly Asia and America. These were compared with Bala's passport, which contained immigration stamps logging his movements since he'd left Poland. And, surprise, surprise, the analysis of the IP numbers showed that whomever had left the comments on the website had been writing from the same places Bala had been visiting at the same time. But it wasn't even this that managed to convict Bala. During witness testimony, one of Bala's acquaintances said that only weeks after the murder, at a New Year's Eve party, a drunken Bala boasted that he had already killed one of Stasha's lovers and that he did it using a rope. Finally, in September 2007, Bala was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His long list of mistakes and errors are indicative of the fact that he just never thought he was going to be caught. People touted him throughout his life as being this genius, having this hugely powerful intellect. But ultimately, he was so cocky and arrogant that it was his downfall. It's pretty satisfying that eventually he incriminated himself by leaving so many loose ends that all led back to him. And that, combined with good police work, meant that the perpetrator was caught and brought to justice. Of course, Bala still maintains his innocence and claims to this day that his novel is just that, a work of fiction. But nonetheless, the similarities in the two stories were strong enough that detectives pursued him relentlessly in an effort to uncover his connection to the murder. The manipulation, his psychopathy, the blatant disregard for others, even the narcissism, were all strongly embedded in the narrative of his story. And ultimately, despite Amok playing no part in his actual conviction, Krystian Bala will always be known as the murderer who incriminated himself in his own novel. If you enjoyed hearing about this case, do let me know in the comments. Viewer engagement would really help me in getting this video seen by more people. But other than that, I'll wrap it up quickly by saying thank you so much for being here and for making it to the end. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.